They said Matthew Carmichael was the man who had it all money charm and a gorgeous wife by his side. Yet the night his wife Evelyn needed him most, he chose dinner with another woman instead. In one shocking twist of fate, Evelyn found herself fighting for her life in a cold hospital room, her husband nowhere to be found. How did this beloved power couple end up battling each other in court over staggering hospital bills, and just how deep did the betrayal cut? Brace yourself for a tale of hidden affairs, scorching vengeance, and high-stakes drama that will keep you enthralled until the very last word. Matthew Carmichael had never wanted for anything. The only son of real estate magnate Edward Carmichael and philanthropist Lucille Carmichael, Matthew was thrust into privilege from birth. Growing up in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Manhattan, he was exposed to lavish parties and glittering soirees before he even learned to tie his shoes. Chauffeurs, private tutors, and high-profile connections were as much a part of his reality as the warm breakfasts the family chef prepared for him each morning. By the time he reached adulthood, Matthew had inherited both his father's business acumen and his mother's penchant for social artistry. He completed a prestigious MBA at Harvard, easily joining the family enterprise Carmichael Properties, a powerhouse in global real estate that boasted properties in New York, London, Dubai, and beyond. He quickly developed a reputation as a brilliant negotiator and an avant-garde strategist who could transform a struggling property into a prime investment with a single phone call. Evelyn Wainwright, by contrast, did not hail from old money. Raised by schoolteachers in a quiet New England town, her early life was marked by modesty and hard work. She excelled in her studies, catching the attention of various scholarship committees. Those scholarships paved her way to Columbia University, where she studied journalism. While Evelyn's path was drastically different from Matthew's, she shared his tenacity and his desire to make a name for herself. Her dream was to become an investigative reporter, to dig deep into the stories that truly mattered and to give voice to people who had none. They met at a ritzy charity gala held at the Plaza in Manhattan. Evelyn was there on an assignment for a small but respected local magazine covering the philanthropic efforts of New York's elite. Matthew was there representing the Carmichael Foundation, which was sponsoring part of the event. Though their worlds collided in a swirl of champagne, quick smiles, and polished surface pleasantries, there was an immediate spark that neither could ignore. By midnight, they were sitting on a velvet bench near the ballroom's exit, discussing everything from social justice to favorite authors, entirely oblivious to the multi-millionaires mingling nearby. Their courtship was a glamorous whirlwind, trips to Europe, weekend getaways to Aspen, and nights on the town where they seemed to sip magic with each glass of wine. Evelyn found herself charmed by Matthew's confidence, his future-driven mindset, and the shimmering gate of possibilities he held open for her. For his part, Matthew was captivated by Evelyn's sincerity, her inquisitive mind, and the unshakable moral compass that guided her every choice. Less than a year after they first met, they were married in a grand ceremony at a lakeside estate in upstate New York. The press took a keen interest in the union. The Princess Bride of Journalism Weds Real Estate read one headline. Another, more critical publication wondered aloud if a woman of Evelyn's convictions could navigate the treacherous waters of upper-class society. She seemed too genuine, too unguarded. But soon enough, it all looked like a fairy tale. Evelyn became the darling of Manhattan's philanthropic circles while also quietly building her career as a freelance journalist. Matthew soared to new heights within Carmichael Properties, earning accolades for his expansions and philanthropic tie-ins. The relationship appeared rock solid, an aspirational union that many envied. But cracks often hide beneath even the most polished surfaces. Deep down, the Carmichael name came with pressure to stay perfect, to uphold an unblemished facade of success and harmony. Over time, unspoken resentments, illusions of greener pastures, and unfulfilled emotional needs took root in the shimmering walls of the Carmichael marriage. Neither of them knew how quickly the foundation would give way when tested, and neither could have imagined the heartbreaking betrayal or the legal fiasco that loomed on the horizon. Evelyn was always proud of her independence. She'd grown up with parents who preached the values of honesty, loyalty, and self-sufficiency. Although she had stepped into Matthew's world, a place of endless opulence, she held tight to her sense of self. At first, Matthew supported her every ambition. He admired her reporting, called her brilliant for seeking out underreported issues, and never hesitated to fund her travels to far-flung places when she uncovered stories that demanded on-the-ground investigations. Yet as Evelyn's work progressed, she found herself immersed in stories that exposed greed, corruption, or exploitation issues that sometimes brushed dangerously close to the orbit of big industries and powerful families, including friends or associates of the Carmichaels. Tension began to brew whenever Evelyn's writing threatened to clash with the interests of Matthew's business connections. A wedge formed, small at first, but significant enough for them to stop seeing eye to eye on certain issues. Matthew had his own pressures. He was now a primary figure in Carmichael properties, where billion-dollar deals were often brokered in hushed negotiations behind the velvet curtains of private clubs. Every day he juggled the demands of the company, the philanthropic expectations that came with the Carmichael name, and the watchful gaze of shareholders and board members who scrutinized his every move. In this environment, Matthew found it increasingly difficult to maintain a facade of unwavering ethics. Corporate expansions sometimes involved lobbying or deals with questionable business partners. Occasionally, philanthropic events masked backdoor deals with local politicians. None of it was outright illegal, but it created ethical gray areas. And while Matthew sometimes felt pangs of guilt, he learned to rationalize these compromises. After all, he believed he was still doing good, building homes, creating jobs, funding charities. Evelyn's first major overseas report was a turning point. She had gone to Thailand to investigate the displacement of locals by luxury resort developments resorts that, unbeknownst to her at the time, had partial financial backing from the Carmichael investment arm. It was an uncomfortable shock when she learned about her husband's indirect involvement, and she confronted Matthew with the moral implications. He argued that it was a complicated business environment, that many families were given compensation, and that the story was more nuanced than her magazine's angle. They could have a conversation, Matthew suggested, in which they both offered balanced perspectives. Evelyn refused to water down the harsh realities some locals faced. For her, it was about truth and justice, not carefully curated PR. It was their first real fight won that left them both unsettled, a small fissure in the bedrock of their marriage. It marked the moment Evelyn realized that love does not automatically align moral compasses. For Matthew, it was a moment of realization that his wife's sense of justice could one day threaten the interests of his family empire. Though they quietly reconciled over time, the undercurrent of tension never fully resolved. Evelyn, now keenly aware of how her work might clash with Matthew's world, sometimes chose safer stories or wrote under pseudonyms. Meanwhile, Matthew delved further into the labyrinth of high-stakes real estate deals, each day entangled in an environment that valued image and profit above all else. As the demands on both of them grew, their closeness began to wane. They spent fewer evenings together, substituting affection with short text messages and expensive gifts that, while thoughtful, didn't address their growing emotional distance. In the penthouse suite they called home, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, the silence could be deafening some nights. They were both chasing visions of themselves, Evelyn, the idealistic journalist seeking truth, Matthew, the ambitious heir, forging success. Their hearts, once locked in unity, began drifting in uncertain directions, sowing seeds of discontent that would soon bloom into full-blown marital crisis. Vanessa Leroy was a charismatic socialite with a reputation for meticulously planning exclusive events for the Manhattan elite. Born into wealth, though not at the Carmichael level, she was known for her keen eye for fashion, her magnetic smile, and a cunning ability to place herself in circles of influence. She and Matthew crossed paths at a fundraising dinner for an art museum in Chelsea, where Carmichael Properties was a headline sponsor. Vanessa was charged with organizing a star-studded auction to benefit the museum, and Matthew was there to represent the family brand. Vanessa possessed an uncanny knack for flattering conversation. She wove compliments about Matthew's business savvy and philanthropic generosity like a weaver spinning silk. He found her attention both exhilarating and relaxing. She made him feel seen and applauded in a way that Evelyn, bogged down by her investigative pursuits, didn't always manage to convey. Where Evelyn questioned Matthew's moral lines, Vanessa seemed in awe of every achievement he flaunted. After the gala, Matthew and Vanessa shared a few more professional encounters. A planning meeting here, a site visit there, each time drifting into personal chatter. Vanessa praised his intelligence, joked about her chaotic but lavish family background, and dropped hints about her philanthropic interests that dovetailed conveniently with Carmichael projects. Before long, it wasn't just business. They began texting, meeting for power lunches under the pretext of new philanthropic initiatives, then moving on to dinners in secluded restaurant corners where public speculation was less likely. Matthew, for a time, wrestled with guilt. He was married after all and had always believed in loyalty, at least that's what he told himself. But the wedge between him and Evelyn made the allure of Vanessa's unwavering admiration irresistible. Where his wife challenged him, Vanessa admired him blindly. Where Evelyn saw potential conflicts and demanded deeper conversations, Vanessa offered indulgent praise and seductive banter. At first, he told himself it was just harmless socializing. They hadn't crossed any lines except those intangible moral ones. The pair's interactions were a well-guarded secret. Vanessa thrived on the drama, likely sensing the power she held over a man like Matthew. She enjoyed the thrill of hidden rendezvous and the surge of adrenaline that came from flirting on the edge of scandal. A chance encounter at a business conference in Chicago, however, amplified their unspoken chemistry. They found themselves dining alone after the day's sessions. The conversation became intimate, both shared confessions about the superficialities of their lives, how they felt unseen or underappreciated, how they wanted something more. Wine flowed freely, and the hotel suite loomed above them like an invitation. That night, Matthew betrayed his marriage vows for the first time. In the weeks that followed, an affair took shape. Secret phone calls, late-night texts, lunches masked as client meetings. The more time Matthew spent with Vanessa, the more he rationalized it. He deserved this release after carrying the weight of family expectations and the friction with Evelyn. He told himself it was temporary, that he would end it once he sorted out his marital issues, whatever that meant. What he couldn't deny was how Vanessa's presence emboldened him. She laughed at his jokes, told him he was brilliant, made him feel invincible. It was as if he'd recaptured a younger version of himself, carefree, admired, unburdened by moral scrutiny. But behind the scenes, Vanessa had her own ambitions. She had every intention of climbing the social ladder, and being close to Matthew Carmichael was a golden rung. Eventually, there were rumors. You can't hide a spark forever, and Matthew was too prominent a figure to move unnoticed. Whispers circulated in exclusive bars, and behind mansion doors, Matthew Carmichael was seen leaving a private lounge with Vanessa Leroy at an odd hour, or they sat cozily at a restaurant in Midtown. Although these rumors hadn't reached Evelyn's ears, she was too consumed by her latest investigative piece, One More Dinner, One More Slip, could blow the secret wide open. And then came the night everything unraveled. The night that Evelyn would bleed alone in a hospital room while Matthew was pouring expensive wine for his mistress. The night that changed their lives forever. It was a crisp autumn evening in Manhattan. The city lights glowed like embers in the twilight sky, a cinematic backdrop to a night that would soon turn from ordinary to tragic. Evelyn had been feeling unwell for a couple of days, dull aches, bouts of fatigue, but she chalked it up to stress. She'd been working tirelessly on an exposé about labor abuses in a clothing manufacturing plant. Feeling the pressure of deadlines and the emotional weight of her findings, she'd postponed seeing a doctor. That evening, while Matthew was preparing to attend a supposedly business-related dinner with Vanessa, Evelyn decided to head home early. She'd promised herself she would schedule a doctor's appointment in the morning. She texted Matthew to say she was feeling poorly, but his response was delayed and terse. He apologized for a busy evening and said he'd check on her when he could. Evelyn didn't have the energy to argue. Around 7 p.m., as she climbed the stairs of their penthouse, the elevator was temporarily out of service due to maintenance. A sudden stabbing pain seized her abdomen. She gripped the railing, heart-pounding, gasping as the pain shot through her body. Uncertain of what was happening, Evelyn managed to stumble inside and dial her doctor's after-hours line. Within minutes, she realized that something was seriously wrong. Her vision blurred, her lips turned numb. The next thing she remembered was collapsing on the plush living room carpet. Meanwhile, across town, Matthew and Vanessa were settling into a discreet booth at a French fusion restaurant in Midtown. Low-lit chandeliers cast an intimate glow over them as they sipped vintage Bordeaux. Vanessa wore a sleek black dress that shimmered with each movement, her eyes dancing with anticipation. Matthew, too, enthralled by her presence and a sense of stolen romance, ignored his phone buzzing in his jacket pocket. By the time Evelyn managed to rouse herself from the floor, panic had fully set in. Her clothes were clammy with sweat, and an unmistakable trickle of blood was staining the front of her blouse. With trembling fingers, she dialed 911. The paramedics arrived swiftly, carrying her out on a stretcher. She was rushed to Bridgeport General Hospital, a relatively short drive, given the light traffic that evening. Weak and frightened, Evelyn repeatedly asked if someone could call her husband. An attending nurse tried the number Evelyn provided Matthew's personal line, but it rang unanswered. While Evelyn was whisked into an emergency surgical procedure, her condition, suspected to be a ruptured ovarian cyst causing internal bleeding, Matthew was clinking glasses with Vanessa, toasting to what he called future possibilities. Those possibilities in his mind were nebulous but thrilling. Exclusive real estate expansions, philanthropic events with only the most elite, and an intoxicating personal liaison that made his heart race. He finally glanced at his phone to see multiple missed calls and a flurry of messages from an unfamiliar number. Concern flickered momentarily across his features, but Vanessa distracted him with a playful remark. He rationalized that if it were truly urgent, someone would try again. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. It wasn't until the meal ended, 2 hours after Evelyn was admitted to the hospital, that Matthew finally checked his voicemail. The messages spoke of an emergency involving his wife, urging him to come to Bridgeport General immediately. His blood ran cold. Hastily, he left cash on the table, muttered a hasty apology to Vanessa, and dashed out the door, leaving her perplexed. He arrived at the hospital with fear gripping his heart, only to learn that Evelyn was in the operating room and in critical condition. That single moment when he realized he had chosen to wine and dine Vanessa while his wife fought for her life alone marked the sharp turning point in Matthew's world. Guilt, terror, and shame collided in his chest. He asked himself, how did I become the man who wasn't there for his wife's darkest hour? No immediate answer came to him, only the knowledge that his life would never be the same again. The repercussions of that night would soon spiral into a legal and emotional storm, one that would shake the Carmichael name to its very core. Evelyn woke in the hospital the next morning, groggy and in pain. Her memory of the previous evening was fragmented. She recalled the collapse, the frantic paramedics, and an operating room's fluorescent glare. A nurse gently explained that she had suffered a rupture requiring emergency surgery, but she was stable now. It would be a long road to recovery, and stress management was crucial. Matthew was slumped in a chair by her bedside, the shadows under his eyes betraying a sleepless night. The guilt etched across his face was impossible to hide, but Evelyn's physical pain overshadowed her fury. She asked only what had happened. Why had he not answered any calls? Where was he? He offered a vague apology about having his phone on silent. Although she sensed there was more to the story, Evelyn was too exhausted to press further. For the moment, she clung to the relief that she was alive and that Matthew was there, albeit belatedly. As days turned into a week, Bridgeport General's staff took excellent care of Evelyn, but the bills quickly mounted. Despite the Carmichael family's wealth, Evelyn discovered that certain insurance claims were getting complicated. She had an independent insurance plan, something she insisted upon maintaining for personal reasons, but it included coverage limits, especially for emergency surgeries at out-of-network hospitals. Moreover, advanced procedures and a private room soared the costs beyond what her policy was willing to shoulder. Traditionally, Matthew would have stepped in without hesitation to cover any outstanding medical expenses. After all, money was never truly an issue for the Carmichaels. But the dynamic had shifted. Evelyn was suspicious of Matthew's story about the night of her emergency. She recalled the nurse's attempt to reach him multiple times, calls that went unanswered. Her journalist instincts told her that something was off, that he had been deliberately inaccessible. Meanwhile, Matthew felt trapped in an avalanche of guilt. He wanted to pay for the bills, to express regret, and make things right. But each time he tried to bridge the gap, Evelyn's pointed questions about his whereabouts on that fateful night set him on the defensive. By the time she was discharged, tension crackled between them like an electric current. Evelyn demanded the truth, and Matthew, cornered by his own conscience, finally confessed to seeing another woman. He insisted it was a moment of weakness, that it had barely begun. Evelyn's heartbreak was immediate and profound. She told him she needed space, needed to think. In a surge of anger and betrayal, she declared that she would pay her own hospital bills. She wanted no part of his money, no part of the life that had made him so callous as to abandon her in her hour of need. Matthew, stung by shame, let her do as she wished, at least initially. He told himself it was what she wanted. But when the final billing statements arrived, they were staggering. Evelyn's insurance covered only a fraction, leaving tens of thousands of dollars outstanding. Drained from her recovery and unable to pivot quickly into full-time work, Evelyn found herself in a precarious financial position. The Carmichael name meant nothing to the hospital's billing department, at least not unless it was matched by an actual payment. Behind the scenes, Vanessa's presence lurked like a dark specter. She reached out to Matthew with half-hearted expressions of concern about his wife's health, but mostly to discuss the future of their liaison. The last thing Matthew wanted was to continue seeing her. Yet he couldn't bring himself to sever ties decisively, possibly out of shame or fear that Vanessa might publicize their affair and bring scandal to the Carmichael brand. A perfect storm brewed. Evelyn, hurt and resolute, wanted independence. Matthew, incapacitated by guilt, vacillated between attempts to salvage the marriage and fleeting escapes to Vanessa's arms, a place where he could momentarily forget his moral collapse. Meanwhile, medical bills piled up, phone calls from the hospital's billing office became more insistent, and Evelyn's bitterness fermented. The cracks that had once been hairline fractures in their marriage were now yawning chasms, threatening to swallow them both whole. The question was no longer if they could salvage their relationship. It was whether they could come out of this unscathed on a public stage, and neither suspected that the drama was about to escalate beyond private arguments, landing them both in a courtroom where every dark secret might be exposed. Evelyn tried to handle the bills discreetly at first. She called the hospital's billing department, hoping to set up a manageable payment plan. The representative, sympathetic but firm, explained that any payment arrangement would still require a hefty upfront deposit to keep the account from collections. Her limited freelance income stood no chance against the financial onslaught. She considered various options, taking out a personal loan, using credit cards, but none were truly feasible. Each day that passed, she felt the relentless weights of mounting interest and late fees. Her resentment toward Matthew deepened with every bill that landed in her mailbox. To Matthew, the simplest solution was to just pay the bill quietly. In the past, he would have done so without a second thought. But now the emotional storm between them was so severe that even a gesture of financial assistance felt loaded with conflicting implications. He tried sending a check directly to the hospital, but Evelyn intercepted it, adamantly refusing what she viewed as tainted money. Their arguments escalated to vicious spats whenever the topic came up, culminating in Evelyn telling him to stay out of it and asserting that she would figure this out on her own. Matthew's father, Edward Carmichael, got wind of the situation through a casual mention from a mutual acquaintance at the hospital's board of directors. Horrified by the potential scandal, his son's wife's unpaid bills, combined with rumors of an affair, Edward quietly urged Matthew to settle the matter. But Matthew was tangled in guilt and immobilized by Evelyn's vehement refusal. The father-son relationship, once built on mutual respect, became tense. Edward despised scandal and demanded that Matthew repair his marriage or handle the divorce swiftly and discreetly. Do not, he warned, let this become a spectacle. Unfortunately, spectacle was precisely where things were headed. A frustrated hospital administration eventually threatened legal action to recover the unpaid balance. Seizing an opportunity, a close friend of Evelyn's attorney, Lisa Baker, offered to represent her pro bono. Evelyn, too proud to accept money from Matthew, welcomed the legal support. What started as a negotiation quickly spiraled into something more when Lisa realized that Matthew had, in effect, contributed to the severity of Evelyn's situation by ignoring her calls and delaying medical intervention. If they pursued a negligence argument, especially given Matthew's vow to love and protect in marriage, there could be grounds for a lawsuit seeking damages beyond just the bills. In a move that stunned everyone involved, Evelyn decided to file a civil suit against Matthew. She claimed he had displayed gross negligence in failing to respond to her medical emergency, which led to further complications and financial distress. She also included emotional distress as part of her damages claim, citing the betrayal and the context of his affair. Matthew, backed into a corner, had to hire his own high-profile lawyer, Trevor Maxwell, to handle the situation. News of the lawsuit leaked to the local press. A sensational story: journalist sues millionaire husband over hospital bills, accusing him of negligence, broke on tabloid websites. It spread rapidly, with social media commentary painting Matthew as either a heartless adulterer or a victim of a woman scorned, depending on one's perspective. For Matthew, the public backlash was swift. High-profile partners at Carmichael Properties began to express concerns about negative publicity. Social media erupted with hashtags condemning him. Some activists supporting women's health rights used Evelyn's story as a rallying cry. Evelyn, meanwhile, found herself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight. She appreciated the sympathy from certain corners, but detested the sensationalism. She had filed the suit as a last resort, a stand against what she saw as a profound betrayal. At the same time, she struggled with heartbreak, longing for the bond she once shared with Matthew. Yet every time she remembered bleeding alone on that cold hospital gurney while he wined and dined, Vanessa's resolve tightened her spine. If the man she married could so coldly disregard her well-being, then he would have to answer for it in court. The stage was set for a trial that threatened to pry open every layer of their private life. Lawyers were assembling evidence, hospital administrators were preparing testimonies, and both families braced for an onslaught of public scrutiny. Love had deteriorated into legal warfare, and neither side seemed poised to concede. The seeds of betrayal had not just blossomed, but had grown into a twisted, menacing tree that overshadowed everything in its reach. The courthouse in Lower Manhattan became an unexpected media hotspot. Cameras lined the steps, flashing relentlessly as Matthew arrived with his legal team, and Evelyn walked in, escorted by Lisa Baker. The tension in the air was palpable. Inside, the polished marble floors echoed with footsteps of reporters, curious onlookers, and the legal teams vying for a good position. Judge Patricia Zimmerman, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for fairness and a sharp wit, presided over the case. From the outset, she made it clear that she would tolerate no grandstanding or theatrics, instructing both parties to keep the proceedings orderly. Still, the air practically crackled with anticipation. This was more than a standard marital dispute. It was a collision of wealth betrayal and life and death circumstances. Lisa Baker presented Evelyn's case first. She recounted the events of the fateful night when Evelyn desperately called Matthew during her medical emergency. Witnesses were called, including the paramedic, who testified that Evelyn was in a precarious condition when they arrived, needing immediate care. Medical experts explained that a quicker response might have prevented the extent of her blood loss. The hospital's billing manager testified to the accumulating costs and the repeated attempts to collect payment. Emotional testimony came from Evelyn herself, who described the panic she felt lying on their living room floor, her body in agony, not knowing if she would live or die. She detailed the heartbreak of discovering her husband's infidelity, explaining that it wasn't merely a betrayal of love, but a betrayal of trust that should have been inviolate, especially when it came to health and safety. Trevor Maxwell, Matthew's lawyer, countered with a strategy aimed at downplaying the severity of Matthew's negligence. He tried to portray the failure to answer calls as a misunderstanding or poor timing. He emphasized that Matthew had arrived at the hospital as soon as he realized the gravity of the situation and that he offered to cover all expenses. They painted Evelyn's lawsuit as vengeful, spurred by personal hurt rather than genuine need. Maxwell also introduced evidence showing that Matthew had tried to send a check to the hospital only for Evelyn to refuse it. But then the mistress's role, Vanessa Leroy, took center stage. Lisa Baker called Vanessa as a witness. Summoned reluctantly, Vanessa arrived wearing a conservative outfit that did little to mask her striking beauty. Tension rippled through the courtroom. In carefully coached testimony, Vanessa admitted to having dinner with Matthew that night, but claimed she had no idea Evelyn was in a medical crisis. Lisa hammered her with questions about the nature of her relationship with Matthew, the frequency of their meetings, and any knowledge she might have had about Evelyn's health. Vanessa tried to appear composed, but her frustration was palpable. She offered only evasive answers regarding the extent of their affair, unwilling to implicate herself in a deeper, moral wrongdoing. Yet her mere presence confirmed Matthew's betrayal in a starkly public forum. Then came the crucial pivot: text message records. Lisa Baker entered into evidence a series of time-stamped messages showing that the hospital staff made repeated attempts to reach Matthew while he was texting Vanessa about wine recommendations. The sequence was painfully clear: call from hospital ignored, another call ignored, text from Vanessa answered. The evidence drew a sharp intake of breath from the gallery. Any attempt by Matthew's lawyer to frame the missed calls as an innocent oversight began to crumble under the weight of digital timestamps. Matthew took the stand, visibly shaken. Under direct questioning from Lisa, he admitted he had been temporarily distracted, but he argued that he had no intention of abandoning his wife. When pressed about why he didn't check his phone sooner, he stumbled, referencing business stress and personal confusion. The longer he spoke, the more the jury could sense his indecision, his moral vacillation. His once confident demeanor eroded under the relentless gaze of Judge Zimmerman, who periodically asked pointed questions about his responsibilities as a husband. Throughout the proceedings, the gossip outside the courtroom soared to fever pitch. Some in the media speculated that this was merely a preamble to a salacious divorce. Others believed Evelyn was on a crusade to expose wealthy spouses who neglect marital duties. Still others predicted that the Carmichael empire might close ranks and pay a massive settlement to hush it all up. But for now, the truth was out in the open, and it was messy, raw, and heartbreakingly human. After days of painstaking testimony, the case moved toward its conclusion. Judge Zimmerman gave both parties a chance for closing arguments. Lisa Baker passionately reminded the court that marriage wasn't just a social contract, it implied a moral responsibility to safeguard each other's well-being. She recounted the emotional toll and the financial disaster Evelyn faced, underscoring that Matthew's neglect and subsequent obfuscations made a mockery of those marital vows. Trevor Maxwell, on the other hand, argued that while Matthew's actions were morally questionable, they didn't meet the threshold for legal liability. He insisted that it wasn't the court's place to punish a marital lapse in judgment, nor to set a precedent that a spouse could be sued for not picking up a phone call. He also implied that Evelyn's refusal of financial assistance was evidence she was leveraging the situation for emotional retribution rather than genuine financial relief. When the jury returned, they found Matthew liable for partial damages related to medical expenses and emotional distress, but not to the full extent Evelyn's side had sought. Specifically, they held him accountable for failing to fulfill a reasonable duty of care, given the nature of their marital bond and the fact that he was aware of her health concerns before ignoring the calls. The court ordered Matthew to pay a substantial sum of money to cover the hospital bills and additional damages for emotional suffering. While the amount was a fraction of Matthew's net worth, it carried symbolic weight. The message was clear. Spouses have legal responsibilities beyond monetary support, and neglect in a medical crisis could carry consequences. A hush fell over the courtroom as the judge delivered the sentence. Evelyn's hands shook. She struggled to interpret her own feelings. She had won, in a sense, yet the victory felt hollow. No legal verdict could erase the betrayal or the trauma she had endured, and Matthew, for his part, appeared equally lost. He'd escaped a more crippling penalty, but in doing so, he'd publicly confirmed the worst version of himself. His reputation lay in tatters, and the entire ordeal had cost him more than just money. It had cost him any remaining semblance of dignity in his marriage. Outside, the press swarmed. Lisa Baker stood by Evelyn, giving a brief statement about the importance of recognizing emotional and financial harm in marital disputes. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved forward, and journalists hurled questions at them both. Evelyn, her face drained, offered a single statement. "I hope my story reminds people that marriage is a commitment to stand by each other in the hardest of times. No one should have to bleed alone." On the other side, Trevor Maxwell guided Matthew through the throng of reporters. He refused to comment beyond acknowledging the court's decision. Vanessa, nowhere in sight, had seemingly retreated from the media spectacle. Rumors flew that she had left Manhattan for a much-needed vacation in Europe. Behind closed doors, Carmichael Properties scrambled into damage control mode. Edward Carmichael released a statement expressing concern for Evelyn's health and emphasizing that personal matters do not reflect the values of the company. Still, business partners whispered about brand image and moral turpitude, while tabloids predicted the decline of the once golden Carmichael heir. In the weeks that followed, the aftershock reverberated in every corner of their lives. Evelyn used a portion of the awarded sum to finally square her hospital bills. Another portion she donated to an organization dedicated to supporting women's health rights, an act that garnered admiration from some and accusations of publicity seeking from others. She moved out of the penthouse and rented a modest apartment in Brooklyn, determined to rebuild her life and career on her own terms. The phone rang incessantly with offers for exclusive interviews, book deals, and speaking engagements. She turned most of them down, craving peace and anonymity. Matthew, meanwhile, tried to salvage his public image through carefully staged apologies and philanthropic gestures. He cut off contact with Vanessa entirely, though the details of their final conversation remained unknown. He told associates he was focusing on intense personal reflection, but rumors circulated that his father was weighing whether to sideline him at Carmichael Properties to avoid further fallout. Their marriage hung by a thread, if at all. The couple had not filed for divorce yet, but reconciliation seemed impossible. They were both left to contemplate the dizzying pace at which love could become betrayal, vows could turn into legal obligations, and personal failures could be splashed across the front pages of tabloids. Their trial had ended, but the real work of moving forward, of learning how to live with guilt, heartbreak, and public judgment had only just begun. In the aftermath, Evelyn found herself navigating a strange mix of isolation and public intrigue. Though she was recognized more often on the streets, it was rarely with warmth. Some saw her as a brave woman who stood up to marital neglect. Others perceived her as opportunistic, dragging personal issues into the courtroom. Her stance remained the same. She'd never wanted a circus. She just wanted justice. She turned her energy toward her journalism, diving headlong into new stories and forging new connections. She felt an urgency to make her ordeal meaningful in some larger context. When an international human rights organization invited her to do a series of investigative pieces, she leapt at the opportunity. The work took her to Southeast Asia and parts of Africa, shining a spotlight on health crises facing women in impoverished areas. It was draining, often heartbreaking, but it made her feel alive and purposeful, reaffirming the core values that had once drawn her to journalism. Matthew, on the other hand, faced an arduous journey of rebuilding. His father quietly maneuvered to keep the company's board calm, and Matthew retained a position, although not as prominent as before. Out of the public eye, he began sessions with a therapist who specialized in high-profile individuals coping with public scandal. Slowly, he confronted the guilt that haunted him since the night Evelyn lay bleeding in their penthouse. For the first time, he considered how the environment he was raised in, where problems were solved with money and reputations were shielded by PR, might have fueled his moral failings. Vanessa Leroy reappeared in Manhattan society's circles a few months later, floating on the arm of another affluent figure rumored to be from London's aristocracy. She kept silent about her relationship with Matthew, perhaps calculating that the scandal no longer served her ambitions. She busied herself with new galas, fashion shows, and perhaps the faint hope that her name would be overshadowed by fresh gossip. The question of divorce loomed. Matthew hesitated to file, clinging to a forlorn hope that he could somehow reconcile with Evelyn. But Evelyn, scarred by betrayal, set her sights on independence. The final straw came during a strained conversation in which Matthew tried to apologize yet again, this time suggesting a new prenuptial arrangement to reassure her financially. Incensed, Evelyn saw this as another attempt to deploy money as a means to solve problems. She quietly told him she wanted a clean break. Their divorce proceedings were far less dramatic than the trial. Both had begun to accept that their once all-consuming love had turned into a cautionary tale. To avoid further public spectacle, they drafted a settlement with as little fanfare as possible. Evelyn insisted on minimal financial compensation, only enough to finalize her transition into a separate life. Matthew respected her wishes, though it pained him. The documents were signed in a sterile law office far from the paparazzi's lenses. In the months that followed, Evelyn flourished professionally. Her exposés gained traction, and she began to accumulate journalism awards. People recognized her dogged commitment to truth and her unyielding moral stance. She found solace among a tight-knit group of friends and colleagues who admired her resilience. Occasionally, she would think back to the early days of her relationship with Matthew, the nights they'd shared stories and dreams under the glimmer of city lights. But she refused to dwell on regrets, focusing instead on a future free from illusions. Matthew continued at Carmichael Properties, albeit overshadowed by a father eager to prevent further missteps. He embraced philanthropic projects, funneling resources into women's health initiatives, whether driven by genuine remorse or an attempt at rebranding. Perhaps it was both. Over time, he gained a subdued humility. The tabloids moved on to fresher scandals. He stayed largely out of the gossip columns, content to work quietly and reflect on what he had lost and why he had lost it. Their paths, once intertwined in a fairy tale romance, were now parallel lines that would rarely, if ever, intersect. But each found a form of redemption, Evelyn through her crusade for truth and justice, Matthew through the introspection forced upon him by public disgrace. The twisted narrative that began with betrayal and concluded in a legal battle had in a strange way offered both a fresh start, one that neither had imagined but both desperately needed. Years had passed since the Carmichael scandal exploded across Manhattan's headlines like a grenade in a ballroom. What had once been the talk of penthouse cocktail hours and whispered brunch conversations eventually faded into background noise, overtaken by fresher scandals and younger socialites with glossier sins. But for Evelyn Wainwright and Matthew Carmichael, time didn't erase the past. It simply taught them how to live with it. Evelyn now resided in a sun-drenched brownstone, nestled in Brooklyn's Fort Greene neighborhood. Her home, modest by her former life standards, was a sanctuary, lined with bookshelves, worn leather chairs, and artifacts from her global assignments. Her career as an investigative journalist had taken off spectacularly. She had won 2 national awards for her coverage on women's healthcare access in sub-Saharan Africa and had just returned from a 6-month expose on illegal mining operations in Indonesia. Her passport was crammed with stamps, her spirit weathered but strong. She lived alone by choice and found a sense of rhythm in her solitude. It wasn't that she had sworn off love, it was that she had finally understood what it cost to compromise her values for the illusion of permanence. Trust once shattered became sacred, and until someone proved worthy of it again, she was content with late-night writing marathons and quiet dinners with fellow journalists who knew what it meant to be consumed by a story. Still, there were moments, brief and uninvited, when her thoughts strayed to the night that changed everything. She'd be in the middle of writing a piece about systemic neglect in women's health, and the memory would return: the cold hospital room, the sterile ceiling lights, the nurse's hesitant voice as she asked if anyone could reach her husband. The ache no longer brought tears, but it left a familiar tightness in her chest. Across the East River, Matthew Carmichael's life had undergone a subtler transformation. After the trial, the Carmichael family quietly repositioned him within the company. No longer the figurehead of high-stakes expansion deals, Matthew was placed in charge of Carmichael Properties' newly created Ethical Impact Division, a role his father had once dismissed as a vanity post. But over time, Matthew embraced it. He channeled funds into building low-income housing units, invested in green building initiatives, and began attending public forums on responsible urban development. Initially, some colleagues whispered that his transformation was mere PR rehabilitation, but those who worked closely with him began to sense something deeper. Matthew no longer entered rooms with the entitled swagger of a man born into wealth. His questions were more thoughtful, his deals more cautious, and in private, he began to see a therapist not out of obligation, but from a genuine desire to understand how he had failed so completely at being the kind of partner he once believed himself to be. He never returned to Vanessa. After the court proceedings, their final conversation was short and mercifully uneventful. Vanessa had moved on her ambitions, finding a new outlet in European fashion circles. Matthew let her go with no fanfare. She had been a symptom, not a cause, a mirror reflecting his worst instincts. The only woman he had ever truly loved now existed in a world entirely separate from his. Evelyn had stopped answering his messages long ago. The divorce had been amicably executed, if emotionally wrenching. Matthew had insisted on a generous settlement. Evelyn had accepted only what was necessary. She wanted no lifeline from the man who had once left her to bleed alone. Still, Matthew followed her career from afar. He read every article she published, watched her TED Talk on medical equity with quiet awe, and donated anonymously to two of the non-profits she supported. He never expected her to know, nor did he want credit. In his heart, it was penance, small gestures toward a debt he could never fully repay. One fall afternoon, years later, fate placed them in the same space again. Evelyn was invited to speak at a panel on ethical journalism at Columbia University. After the discussion ended, she descended the auditorium steps and spotted a tall, familiar figure lingering at the back of the room. Matthew stood quietly near the exit, hands in his coat pockets, eyes weary but kind. Their eyes met. Neither of them moved at first. Finally, Evelyn approached. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said softly, her voice even. "I didn't expect to come," he admitted. I saw your name on the program. Thought maybe I should hear you speak again." She nodded slowly. "You look different." "So do you." A silence settled between them, not awkward, just full of everything unspoken. "I read your pieces," he said. "The one in Mali about the clinic shortages. I couldn't stop thinking about it." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you." Another pause. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," he said more gently than he ever had before. "Not just for that night. For all of it. For every time I chose comfort over conscience." Evelyn studied him. He didn't look like the man she had once loved, the man who had charmed her in a ballroom and taken her to Paris on a whim. No, this man was quieter, humbler, perhaps even wiser. But she didn't feel the old spark. What she felt was closure. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said. "Not for your sake, for mine." Matthew's throat tightened. "I'm glad you did." She placed a hand on his arm lightly, briefly. "We were never meant to stay together, Matthew, but I hope we both learned how to become better people because of it." And with that, she walked away, disappearing into a crowd of young journalists, buzzing with admiration and energy. Matthew didn't try to follow. That night, he returned to his apartment and opened the folder of articles Evelyn had written. He reread her profile on a nurse in rural Bangladesh who saved a mother from a complicated childbirth with nothing but gauze and instinct. At the end of the piece, Evelyn had written, "Sometimes saving someone isn't about heroism, it's about presence. It's about choosing to show up when it matters most." He closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long while. Meanwhile, Evelyn returned to her brownstone, poured herself a glass of red wine, and lit a candle in her reading nook. She didn't think much more about the encounter. It hadn't reopened wounds. If anything, it sealed them. Outside, a light snow began to fall, soft, silent, and forgiving. In the end, the story of Matthew and Evelyn wasn't about tragedy. It was about growth. It was a reminder that the people we become often emerge not from our triumphs, but from how we survive our worst mistakes. It was a testament that healing isn't always about repairing what broke. Sometimes it's about building something entirely new from the ruins. And in the quiet corners of New York City, two people did exactly that, separately, bravely, and forever changed. The rise and fall of Matthew and Evelyn Carmichael became a lesson far beyond tabloid fodder, a testament to how love can disintegrate when honesty and empathy slip away. Ultimately, it was also a story of resilience, of forging anew from the wreckage of betrayal, and of recognizing that no fortune is grand enough to replace the simple act of caring for one another. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you think twice about the true value of a relationship, we invite you to stay connected. Please like this video, share it with someone who might appreciate a cautionary tale, and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic, real-life narratives. Your engagement helps us continue uncovering stories that shine a light on the raw truths hidden behind glamour and wealth. Thank you for watching, and remember, compassion can be our greatest fortune.